So the Russian Civil War actually began with the October Revolution of 1917, which was neither a revolution nor actually took place in October. And it ended in June of 1923. And within the course of those 6 years, 15 million Russians end up losing their life, and it was absolutely devastating for the country. What ended up arising from that is obviously the communist regime, which ended up taking over, and that's why you end up having the Soviet Union. But within this video, we're going to look at all the different factions within this. So first of all, starting off with the White Forces. So the very first person we're going to look at is Kolchak. So Kolchak probably had the best chances of defeating the Reds and uniting the White Forces, mainly as a result of the fact that he was supported by the Western Allies. And he also agreed to the terms which the Western Allies laid out for him, which was that, for instance, there should be no reinstatement of the monarchy. So obviously the Tsar had been overthrown in 1917 because he was very unpopular. So whilst many of these generals within the White Forces were very sympathetic to the monarchy, they understood the situation of like, actually, you know what, realistically, we can't bring him back. And the Western forces are certainly not going to support us if we try and bring him back. And also as well, we should say that potentially Kolchak could have been the future dictator of Russia. And the reason for this is mainly as a result of the fact of he was very authoritarian. He essentially led the government which they had set up as such. And so it was the natural, logical thing that were the Whites to end up winning, he would have risen to the top and been the kind of new autocrat of Russia. So you would have replaced the Tsar and instead had this guy who would have basically been a kind of proto-fascist kind of like dictator. So he would have been very nationalistic, and yeah, so that's essentially what would have happened if he had taken over. Next, we're going to talk about Denikin, who was very much a reactionary force. So again, he was one of the generals within the White Forces, and also he was very anti-Semitic. So even Winston Churchill actually critiqued the support of the White Forces and basically said, if people like Denikin end up kind of taking over, it's going to give us a very bad reputation because we can't be seen to be supporting a regime which is doing pogroms and other discriminations against Jews and other ethnic minorities. So he was also very ultra-nationalist and also very racist as well. But the important thing to kind of say with him is that actually, as opposed to many of the other generals who were in the White Forces, he actually wanted an end to military rule. And so he wanted Russia to be governed by the Russian people, right? So rather than having it as a kind of military junta or having it as a dictatorship, he thought that as soon as peace is restored, then the Russian people should form a republican government. Next, we're going to talk about Kornilov, who again was a reactionary. So he was famous for the famous Kornilov affair, which took place in August 1917. And this is an attempted coup to overthrow the provisional government. Now, the reason for this is because the provisional government was basically seen as weak. And within that same government, this is where the Bolsheviks started to gain more and more power. So in an act of counter-revolution, he decided that he was going to do a coup, overthrow the provisional government, destroy the Bolsheviks, and then, yeah, so that was his kind of aim. So you could already see even before the Civil War, he was very much opposed to the Bolsheviks, right? And so it's kind of unclear as to what he necessarily would have done, but we can see once again that he was very much a reactionary and was actually kind of leaning more towards restoring the monarchy. And then finally, with regard to the White Forces, we're going to talk about Wrangel. So he originally was a monarchist, but he was willing to serve under a republican government. And actually later in the Civil War, he actually pushed for land reforms for the peasants in order to try and win them over. So if he had ended up taking over, or if he had had some hand in the new white government of Russia, there probably would have been some concessions made for the peasantry to try and win them over. So that's something to kind of like really bear in mind. So in summary, with regards to the White Armies, if they'd end up defeating the Bolsheviks, more likely than not, Russia would have been very authoritarian, it would have been very racist, it would have been very anti-Semitic, but you would have avoided many of the things which would have come with the Soviet era and like, so all the kind of purges and, genocides, etc., etc. There still arguably might have been genocides, especially of the Turkic people within Central Asia, and also, of course, the Jews, especially because at the time they blamed the Jews for being revolutionaries. People like Trotsky, people like Lenin, many of these people were either Jews themselves or the descendants of Jews. And so as a result of that, the propaganda of the White Forces were basically saying that the Bolsheviks were part of a Jewish conspiracy to destroy Mother Russia. So Probably as a backlash of that, many horrible things would have happened, but still, that's kind of an interesting kind of thing to kind of like point out.
Hello there.
That's not how you say that. And also, who the hell are you?
I'm Possible History, and you asked to do a collaboration with me.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Okay. Yeah, Possible History, absolutely brilliant channel. Definitely go and check out their video on what if the Bolsheviks didn't surrender. Absolutely brilliant video, absolutely brilliant channel. I'm a massive fan of them. They've helped me out quite a bit. Hopefully I can help them out quite a bit as well. So yeah, definitely go onto their channel, subscribe to them, and big shout out to them for doing this collaboration. And now, time to go back to the video. So now we're going to start talking about the foreign armies of intervention. And we have to start off, first of all, with the largest force, which were the Japanese. So the Japanese sent 70,000 troops into Russia. However, it should be noted that their aims wasn't really the same as the Western forces. And the reason for that is because they just saw this as an opportunity to have a naked land grab, in particular of Vladivostok and also Sakhalin Islands and the Kuril Islands, right? So basically, they want to take over a lot of Russia's far east, and so they saw the Civil War as an opportunity to expand their own the territorial gains, right? So that was essentially why they were there. And it's also the same reason why the Romanians were there as well. They sent in 50,000 troops, and that was to take over Bessarabia, which today we would call Moldova. So Moldova is majority Romanian, and so they want to unite the Romanian people. So that kind of explains why the Japanese and the Romanians were there. They were just in it for themselves. They didn't actually care about Russia or the Russian government. They just wanted to do a land grab, right? But also we should talk about the Czechoslovak Legion. So they were just madmen, right? So they were Czechoslovakian POWs, yeah, right, who had been fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the First World War. So they were prisoners of war within the Russian Empire. And so when the Civil War kicked off, they basically just did a mad thing where they just took over vast swathes of the Trans-Siberian Railway. And they didn't really have any war aims. They just wanted to mess some things up. So as soon as World War One ended and Czechoslovakia ended up becoming independent, they all just went home. So there was almost 50,000 of them, and yeah, they just caused a bit of havoc, but there's no way that they would have won the Civil War, and they had no interest in winning that anyway. But yeah, so a little bit of side note with regard to that. And now we have to talk about the Western forces, yeah, which intervened. And first of all, we have to talk about the reasons why they intervened. So the very first reason was because they wanted to prop up the Russian government, in particular in the very first instance of it, which was obviously in light of World War One. So they obviously want to make sure that Russia stayed within the war in order to keep German troops away from being able to go to the Western Front. So they wanted to retain the Eastern Front, and the best way of doing that was propping up the Russian government there. The next aim was the fact of, again linked to World War One, they wanted to make sure that there was a Russian government which would repay their war debts. Because obviously the British, the French and the Americans, in particular the British, they basically bankrolled the Russians to basically stay in that war, and they obviously wanted some of their money back. So if the Bolsheviks took over, as ended up happening in our own timeline, they didn't get any of that money back. So they wanted to preempt that and make sure that the Bolsheviks didn't end up taking over. And then the third and final thing comes again with the fact of communism. They wanted to be counter-revolutionaries. They wanted to, as Churchill said, he wanted to strangle communism in its cradle. So that was the main kind of like aim for them. That's what they essentially wanted to do. So the British, they sent in, well, in terms of the whole, not just the British Army, but also other imperial forces, so from India, Australia, Canada, etc. They in total sent 64,000 men into Russia. And then as a smaller contingent, the French sent 15,600, but obviously they were mainly focused in on the Western Front and they were quite devastated from the war, so they didn't really have that many to spare. And then the Americans, they sent in 13,000 troops for that, because at this time they were starting to become isolationist again. So they kind of sent troops in a little bit, but they weren't really that invested in what was actually happening. And also as well, they kind of saw it as, why are we going to prop up the white forces, which clearly aren't liberal, clearly aren't democratic. Obviously, America, a big reason why it joined World War One, and a lot of the propaganda was, we are fighting on the side of freedom, we are fighting on the side of democracy. So to prop up an authoritarian dictatorial regime, whether it's under the Tsars or the communists or under the White Army, would have been quite hypocritical, and that's why many Americans couldn't really get behind it. So that explains the foreign armies of intervention. And now we're going to talk about what, in my opinion, is the most interesting part, which is the Green and Black armies. So first of all, who were they? So the Black armies were anarchists, right? So these people here were anarcho-syndicalists. So the best way of kind of describing anarcho-syndicalism is basically imagine communism without the central state, right? Or without any state at all. So what they wanted to do is have Soviets, which is workers' councils, and they wanted to have that basically run the entire of society without the need for there being a government. So that's one of the things that they were kind of arguing for. So obviously, as a result of that, they ideologically clashed with the Bolsheviks. And then also you're having the Green armies. So the Green Army, they tended to draw their support from the Social Revolutionary Party. Now, in Russia's only free fair election in 1917, they actually won that election. So they got 37.6% of the total vote, as opposed to the Bolsheviks, who had just 23.3%. And actually, they ended up having 1 million members within 1917. And in that election, they had 17 million voters. And what they were arguing for was agrarian socialism. So at the time, the Bolsheviks obviously were advocating the proletariat. And the proletariat is the industrial working class, obviously mainly centered within the city. But these people, the social revolutionaries, they tended to have their support mainly from the peasantry. And at this time, Russia was 80% agricultural, 80% rural, 80% peasant. So obviously their platform of agrarian socialism, which obviously, land redistribution and like kind of more equitable thing for the peasants, this obviously appealed to a much larger swathe of the Russian population. However, they were only able to field 70,000 people, and the Black Army, they were able to field 100,000. So even combined, even when the two of them merged their forces together to fight both the Reds and the Whites, they still weren't able to amass that many people. And part of the reason for this simply comes down to the fact of, at this time, the Russian peasantry were just not very well educated, were not very well politicized. So for them, they were indifferent to who was ruling them, whether it was the Tsar, the Bolsheviks, the Whites, the Greens, the Blacks. It really didn't matter to them as long as they had bread and food and stuff. They really were not really that interested. So the fact that even though they had 17 million voters, they could only field 70,000 men to actually fight for them, kind of gives you an indication as to the reason why they lost. So for them to win, they would have had to mobilize, that large segment of the Russian population to be on their side. So had they won, Russia would have been very, very